So we began this morning talking about the economics of digital, and to complete that journey through the political economy of digital, we'll talk a little bit about the politics of digital. So I'm very pleased to welcome Mark Thompson. Mark is the Senior Lecturer of Information Systems at the Cambridge Judge Business School. He has been an advisor to Cabinet Office, and certainly is a very well regarded commentator and speaker in relation to all matters of public sector digital kind of world. So very warm welcome to Mark Thompson.
Thank you. I will say that just on the badging of these slides, I've got a slightly, a kind of split personality here, because I believe it's important to speak truth to power from an academic standpoint, but I also help to run a supplier as well, and I very often wish to God I hadn't said things as an academic that then come and haunt me as a supplier. When Paul shot me an email, I don't know, probably January, and said, do you want to talk about the politics of digital as the last kind of slot in Socitm? My initial reaction was, you've got to be kidding, mate. There's no way I'm going to do that. And then I kind of came around to it and thought, well, someone's got to stand up here and do it. I don't have a hotline to Dave. I don't have a hotline to Ed, I'm afraid. And I don't have the answers. And it's so all I've got to really to offer you, I think, is a set of observations. I'm going to go quite quickly, and because we're sort of digitally literate audience here already, and my views are very much all my own. So I think digital is becoming more political, and I think it needs a bit of recognition. So just to sort of get us orientated, many people will recognise this UK Commission statement. This is the sort of stuff we've been talking about all day, so I'm actually going to move on very, very quickly from that. Okay, we know we've got to become more digitally, joined up and oriented and clever, and this is what we all spend our time talking about. Okay, so that's the goal. That's what we're going to try and do. Problem is, a chap called Professor Christopher Hood, who writes a lot about this kind of stuff. He's based in Oxford. He's commented very tellingly, I think, we're living in the era of no one in charge, and particularly in local government, of course, we've got the local government agenda. So there isn't anybody in charge. Government is increasingly interconnected and networked with all sorts of suppliers, third sector organisations, economic global forces. We don't have a set of kind of 7 levers that we can pull to make things happen. And indeed, that's part of the frustration, if you like, of digital, particularly in local government, which is why it makes these kind of things, these discussions interesting. So we kind of know where we've got to go. And it's not particularly easy because we can't just pull levers and make it happen. What I was hoping there would be a kind of pointer, so I could point to some of these bits of text, but I'll wave my arms around instead. Somebody I have a huge amount of respect for in the political sphere is Margaret Hodge, because again, I think she very often speaks truth to power. Okay, so in trying to sort of make some of these things happen, one of the recent things she's pointed out, of course, this was after the botched attempt to re-procure the West Coast Main Line, which led to a kind of national hand-wringing episode in terms of both our politicians and senior public servants' ability just to do it. There's a sense that we just don't have the skills in-house to do that, and we don't necessarily have the interest of our politicians. And I think tellingly, she talks about the DFT. You can see here, the pen is too much. I'm just going to point it out here, over here.
There's a laser on these.
Yeah, it just doesn't really work with screens very well. It kind of loses itself. But it spends too much on consultants. The Public Accounts Committee found in 2010 it spent 70 quid on consultants for every £100 spent on in-house staff. Okay, yeah. Too often there appears to be an incestuous group of consultants and companies seamlessly moving between one another in or out of Whitehall, etc. We're kind of maybe familiar with some of that, but again, I think Margaret Hodge we can kind of increasingly rely on to speak truth to power. So we don't have the skills, and there's a little bit of unholy dependency on some of our professional advisors. This is being picked up. This is a recent Policy Exchange publication that picks it up. This is their report on digital government. And again, at the bottom, if you look, leadership and change management is a serious challenge for government. It will take a lot of people out of their comfort zones, and some will not stay the course. Okay, so we know what we've got to do. It's not simple to get there, and we really lack. We're very, very dependent on other people to help us get there, and we don't have yet enough leadership and certainly not enough skills. And because of that, of course, we're moving quite slowly. I don't know, some of you may have seen this. This has been doing the Twitter rounds recently. It basically shows that 1% of government IT spend is going through PSN at the moment. Okay, so we've got a long way to go. In other words, yes, fantastic work, it's all very important, but it is being held back by some of these things, and it's very important. And of course, one of the things that we can all do about it is to raise this stuff up the political agenda. Okay, so let's have a look at that. Obviously, in the right-hand corner of the ring, ding ding, we've got Francis. I went to sat on their digital policy panel in Manchester last year, and I think it's fair to say on both sides, Tories and Labour, I'm not going to get into UKIP just yet, that I think at the time of the political conferences there wasn't really a lot of thinking about manifesto. So we can probably assume there's going to be a continuation of more of the same, so in other words, getting the digital exemplars to work. Obviously PSN is hugely important, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. For example, Liam Maxwell is obviously trying to migrate 50% of government infrastructure contracts away from their existing incumbent suppliers by end of 2015. That's going to be an enormous amount of work. There's latterly, I think he's recently appointed an architect, and about which more later. So I think the Tories thus far, unless somebody can enlighten me, have been relatively quiet on the kind of election manifesto aspect of digital. However, of course, we've been hearing quite a lot recently from Labour, which is extremely interesting, and it was actually Chi Onwurah from Newcastle who announced that they were going to do a digital policy review at a digital leaders conference I was chairing last year. It wasn't, maybe not the most auspicious beginning, because she started by saying government's got no vision for digital Britain. If you look at that bottom, the report that Labour delivered last year of our government, Digital Britain, has yet to be superseded. In other words, saying there's absolutely nothing new about any of the efforts over the last 4, 5, 6 years. I got into a little bit of a spat with her in Computer Weekly, but we're all kind of made up and friends now, simply because I didn't necessarily think that was the best kind of way forward. But recently, of course, Brian Bick at Computer Weekly has been taking much more of an interest. They have launched a digital review, and I have to say, from my limited interaction with it thus far, they seem to be very, very switched on. There's a chap called Peter Wells who's leading the review, who's doing some great things and absolutely seems to get it. Nonetheless, of course, it's very political. Again, this is it's very febrile, and we've got to be careful what we say. So there's a chap called Alex Blanford, who some of you may follow on Twitter. He went to the digital launch. I thought this was quite a funny reaction. There was an event, good start. Martha Lane Fox spoke, first time I've seen her in real life. Not a single person from Labour I spoke to demonstrated any experience of government digital, either as a civil servant working on projects in the private sector or even having read the service design manual. Spoke to people who didn't know what Agile is, etc., etc. Well, that wouldn't necessarily chime with my sense of where they're going, but the point is we've all got to be pretty careful about what we say. So, talking about what we say, what does Chi say? Because this is maybe one of the earliest indications of some of where their focus might be. And you can see halfway down she says, so what is the Labour vision of digital government? The internet and big data should lead to more direct, horizontal as opposed to vertical relationships. There's a big clue in that, and I would summarise one of the most interesting things about Labour's digital review thus far is its focus on architecture. They're very, very willing to talk about or place greater emphasis on reuse and consumption and platforms, again about which more in a second, than maybe has been the case thus far. It requires the right infrastructure and architecture to drive digital transformation through local and national government. I think there's also probably more of an explicit focus on local services as well. So we've heard a lot about it already, but bringing together local services, health, blue light, etc., housing, and quite a lot more evidence, quite a lot more attention to that. It's a very exciting period. I was involved with the Tories' kind of pre-election manifesto period last time round, and there was a real sense of empowerment. This is an open call. This is an example of what they're looking at this week. Okay, it's proposition. The move towards digital government requires a culture change and skills refresh. Those are some of the very sensible questions they're asking. They want to hear from everybody. And it is absolutely, I believe, in the political cycle, there is a very, very small window before they close these manifestos down in August, September, to actually have your voice heard. It's possibly the most fruitful part of the entire democratic process that we live in. So I would urge anybody who's interested in this to engage with them. Anybody can send anything in. If you've got some strong views about what Labour should be doing with digital, now is the chance. You have a very real chance to affect policy. So it's worth putting that out. Okay, so very quickly I wanted to kind of offer 5, 6 observations about political angles to digital. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more from both of them. Okay, so I'm not going to read them all out because we're going to go through them one by one. So first of all, left or right? I think it's very important actually that we start to think about the political implications, particularly at local government, of digital. So for example, we all know that it's insufficiently still or digital business models are insufficiently taken up and chewed over by chief execs and cabinets. Why is that? I don't really know. However, we need to really engage people in terms of the political implications of some of the de-verticalising that we're all talking about. And I think some of them are very real. So I think a Tory council could interpret some of the implications of new digital business models very differently from a Labour administration. And one of the ways maybe of getting members' interest is to actually engage them in some of the kind of political angle, if you like. I had a bit of a go at Chi following her announcement, because among other things, they said the Tories were politicising agile, things which I didn't think particularly helpful. And it just shows, I think, that we all need to be careful. I think maybe not to cheapen the political project by making it a left or a right issue. I think my point was that I was maybe a bit ill-advised. I used a quotation from George Orwell's Animal Farm, and I guess my notion was that the creatures, us, were looking outside, were looking from pig to man and man to pig, the Labour and the Tories, and already it was impossible to say which was which. In other words, I don't think making political points about digital is necessarily the way forward. And why is that? Well, because digital has enormous implications for the structure of our public services, as we know. And those implications are fundamentally about disintegration of vertical silos and adoption of platforms. Something I thought was particularly interesting last year, another national hand-wringing episode that we had, was when Mrs. Thatcher died. And there was all that kind of revisitation of some of the toxicity of the late 80s in terms of what was her political legacy. And Janan Ganesh is a correspondent I've got a lot of respect for. And I think the point about this article is buried over here. Right over here. He says, and he was talking about the Tories, but it applies to all of us, the party's future lies in the popular capitalism that aggressively backs the consumer and the entrepreneur over the cartel and the state. And I think what he was trying to say was that whether you're HSBC or HMRC, the cosy days of kind of big corporates and corporate modes of organising are increasingly becoming under threat, and new horizontal platform-based business models raise questions for all of us. And I think that's it's a question for Labour as much as it is for the Tories. What does, for example, digital socialism look like? You know, if the kind of digital business models we've been talking about are less vertically integrated, more platform-based, more open to the little guy, then what does that mean for example, the union bloc vote? I think it's likely to change the landscape, proper transformation, not just leaning and outsourcing, the sort of pretend transformation we've been up to for the last 20, 25 years. Proper business model transformation is going to be enabled by digital over time, and there is insufficient engagement at national level with that debate. So I think that's very important. Short or long term, something we've obviously noticed, apologies to anybody in here from Birmingham, but this is obviously national, this is public domain stuff. Obviously the recent fuss over the Birmingham library website, something which on the blogosphere people reckon should have cost 10 grand, cost 1.2 million, and whatever it was, some 7.5 grand desktop PC, etc., etc. I think that is starting to raise a lot more interest now, particularly because, of course, digital is about breaking things up and about consumption, about switching, lowering switching costs. The notion of tying yourself up for 5, 10 years in a kind of cryogenic frozen state is becoming more questionable. And I think our politicians are going to start to take more of an interest in it. We can already see it. This is a very interesting NAO report. People might want to have a look at that. It's called The Role of Major Contractors in Delivery of Public Services. I won't point out some of the eye-watering numbers on the right, which is the share of market of some of these organisations. But I think maybe in the last administration, when the SIs became the kind of big bad guys, maybe we'll see under the new administration actually some of the service outsourcers becoming the new sources of concern. And certainly the NAO is starting to ask some quite pointed questions, such as the ones on the right in that document. Are public service contracts sufficiently competitive? And they're talking about the big ones. Is the rise of a few major contractors in the public interest? And more of a sort of open dialogue about that. So I think with digital, we're going to find it harder, frankly, just to have one number, an annual number for our IT than we used to, and certainly also in terms of service delivery. So I think there's going to be some more tension there. Agile or open standards. Boy, this is one I've been feeling the heat of recently. A couple of months ago I wrote wrote an article called that, Searching for the Signal of Open Standards Amid the Growing Noise of Agile. My point I tried to make was that digital seems to be increasingly becoming synonymous with Agile. I pointed out a little bit of a pattern, maybe within GDS for developing and building things, open source or otherwise, and pointed out that that's very important, but that digital has a yin and a yang. Okay, if the yin is the building, it's the Agile, it's the open source. The yang is absolutely reuse, standards, consumption-based models, and an evolving architecture which exposes the hidden commonality right across the UK. And nowhere is that more applicable, as we all know, than in public services. That was picked up properly by Wired UK, who pretty much reported what I said. This is on Friday, by the way, about 10 doors down the road. So this is why it's kind of I talk about this because it shows quite how political some of these things are coming. I didn't say government doesn't get it, and I had to actually publish what I said on my own website, just to kind of, and then here you can see somebody else getting it slightly wrong. I'm already scratching my head with worry, and I've since gone and got a haircut, so hopefully people won't notice me in the street. The problem is I think digital is becoming much more political, and I think there is a sense that Agile needs to be balanced with an equal attention to reuse platforms and architecture, which is why I come back to the encouraging attention I think that Labour is beginning to play to talking about the architecture and the reuse as well as the Agile. Which brings us all again to platforms and the notion of centre and periphery. I thought I'd stick this one up because we've known about it a long time in Methods because we actually build and run it. So the quick pot of history behind this, I think you'll like it because it demonstrates the power of platforms, is that in 2003, Department of Health came out for a tender for an e-recruitment system. So I guess a relatively normal kind of old school procurement exercise to buy a piece of tech. Of course, the danger was that, or the risk in this was that DOH needed to persuade 650 NHS organisations, HR organisations, to stop doing things their own ways and to actually use a platform. And without that user take-up, it was dead. So 10 years later, it's saved over £1 billion. It's provided a national clearing, national clearing platform, etc. But that's actually not those benefits are obvious. The revealing piece about this is DOH retendered the contract a couple of years ago, and the terms were very different this time. Government said, you know what, NHS Jobs is such a valuable platform because of all the hits it gets that we want our successful supplier to run it for not exactly free, but for very, very close to cost. And we're going to select the successful supplier on the basis not of their ability to run the platform, but on the quality of the additional innovation services that they can come up with, such as, for example, ECRB checking, that they can run on that platform. So looking back, over the last 10 years, we've moved from something which was every and there are huge parallels with local government here. Every NHS organisation running their own procurement, no visibility nationally, and it being really quite expensive, to enormous savings, but most of all, government getting a close to free service. And I just wonder, for local governments, again architecturally, whether there aren't some other things that we could think about in more platform terms for local government too. I don't want to bang on too much about this, but just to explain that a little bit more, and anyone who's heard me banging on about this stuff before will know I'm pretty obsessed with distinction between bespoke stuff and the commodity stuff. And I think people are getting more used to some of this stuff, the utility, the commodity platforms at the right, and bespoke stuff at the left. There's a chap called James Findlay, who's CIO of HS2, who's done some fantastic work on this. This is his very, very high-level model of what he's done to HS2. So you can see on the right-hand side, bottom right, he's got his power, he's got his compute, his HR, his website. They're commodities. He's going to buy those in. He's not going to think about building that stuff. In the middle, we've got some shared service centre kind of operations going on, and only at the left, when he absolutely needs to sort of build things, is he building things. So he's starting to profile these things already. He's starting to treat those aspects of his IT in very, very different ways, which is quite interesting as well, I think. Very different characteristics, leaning in agile or opposite ends of the spectrum. And then perhaps most beautifully of all, we've now got some appropriate procurement routes that drop out of the way that you can treat those. So you can see common government services are much more suitable for the more kind of commoditized aspects of what he's doing. He's subsequently built this thing out, but he can't share it because it's obviously government property. One of my own experiences with similar sort of thinking is we've been very involved with helping Hounslow move to, I think, what is the first ever true public platform-based local government digital business model, and you can obviously see that on the top. You've got your Salesforce, yes, that's proprietary, but it's open APIs. The Amazon is obviously public cloud, a strong commitment to that in terms of Box. You can see the kind of easy swappable document sharing. You can see Jitterbit there for social media. You can see some fairly radical approaches to redefining underlying our platform-based architecture and what that's likely to do to business models. I haven't got time to talk too much about it, so I won't. Finally, the kind of the last, I think, major piece I wanted to talk about was public or private sector jobs. Liam Maxwell, CTO, very famously went to the chief exec of DEFRA, I think, and said, "Why aren't you a website?" And I think the answer was, once he'd kind of recovered having been thrown out in the street, because of, obviously DEFRA is, amongst other things, a major employer in North Wales. So without an accompanying national dialogue and debate about the appropriate functions of public servants in a digital world, which are going to be much, much more, of course, about commissioning, much, much more about architecture, much, much more about face-to-face public services, and I would argue a hell of a lot less about back-office bureaucracy. Without that kind of debate and kind of delta, acknowledgement of that delta we've got to go through, again, I think some of the digital implications are going to go unnoticed. So I think there's a very, very important discussion, and I think, to be honest with all of ourselves as a country, we need to start to debate the digital implications of Agile. So I think that's most of what I want to say. 3 minutes, okay. Thank you, Steve. I think ultimately we need to start asking who benefits in the end for this. Do we really want digital? Who benefits from it? Is it Town Hall and its key suppliers? In other words, is it the corporates? Is it the silos? Or actually is it the frontline services and the ecosystem, whoever they may be? And this is a political issue. It is one for, I believe it's absolutely a cabinet issue. It's not necessarily one for CTOs and CIOs, although we absolutely need to be priming those discussions. So I think digital is becoming much more political. It's getting higher up to the top because, of course, we've heard mentioned thus far as well of the need to, it wasn't said exactly like this, but it's about driving new business processes and new business models, actually, rather than just the kind of platform of joining things up with technology. So I believe, certainly, we've really got to understand and have a view as CTOs and CIOs and local government on public service architecture. Get involved in that labour discussion, because it's a good one and they appear to be listening. So it's worthwhile doing that. I think we're going to have to be much more mature about the evolving commercial landscape, our relationships with suppliers, distinction between types of suppliers, when it is and when it is not any longer appropriate just to outsource. If we are outsourcing, we're conducting benchmarking, what on earth are we comparing it with? Are we comparing it with old style type of costs and capabilities, or the art of the possible? And I think we need much more clarity about that. I was going to show you a 3.5-minute video, but I think I've run out of time, which is a shame. If anybody wants to look it up on YouTube, it's 3.5 minutes. It attempts to make a dull subject amusing. I did it as a result with Anthony Kemp from Hounslow and Mark Foden, and it does kind of it gives you a kind of a relatively easy overview of one particular vision of platform-based local government. So that's my one plug for that video, which I don't have time to show you. So final slide. It is political. I've offered a number of things there. Of course, the big one I've left out is probably data and information, but I guess my counter to that would be that data and information runs, it is the living tissue underpinning everything that we're talking about. So I would say it's kind of in the DNA of everything that I've said there. But do we want this? Are we just doing it because we're told to? Are we doing it because of Cabinet Office directives? Who's actually driving this? Is it the business? Is it IT? And are we having a sufficient national debate about it? I'll stop there.
Any questions? Martin?
Yeah, Mark.
Microphone's on the way to you, I think.
Mark, thank you very much for that. Just a question really about the role of Socitm in all of this. A professional association, we've often sort of taken the view that we remain agnostic and stay out of political controversy. What can a professional association do to actually engage in a political debate of this nature?
Gosh, so now I'm going to try not to get myself into any more trouble, so I'm going to sort of weigh my words carefully. So obviously to have, and I've been calling for people to have, to kind of step up and take those political views and opinions. However, I think the major thing in my experience, which is limited, like everybody else's, that politicians listen to, is action starting on the ground. And if people start getting going and it starts looking like a bit of a success, then it's amazing how quickly we get political interest and the desire to be aligned with it. And it certainly seems to me that the power of platforms and local government is about trying to expose all of the hidden commonality which we have 300-400 times across the country. It's hidden because it's all still massively locked up, black box, integrated, and one of the most interesting projects I think it's possible to get involved in, and I'm desperately encouraging Labour to think about it, is to try and find a way to encourage people in local government to map their businesses using a similar methodology, which will then yield, if you like, a kind of 3D evolving architecture, a living architecture of shared capability. Not shared services, because we all know the problem with shared services is you can share my service and may the most muscly, vertically integrated organisation win. And that's typically a kind of bipartite or tripartite thing. I'm talking about shared capability at unit level right across the country. It's possible, it just needs some leadership. And if anyone wants to talk about it afterwards, I'm delighted.
So maybe just add a little bit to that. The Socitm has, obviously Socitm is a non-party political organisation, but I certainly accept the statement that digital is political, and as outgoing president I can probably get away with saying a few more things than perhaps as an incoming president you might be able to me. So I'll take that opportunity. So many of the officers of Socitm are in politically restricted roles, but nonetheless you'll have an opportunity to talk to if any party political organisation comes and asks you for professional guidance and advice, you certainly volunteer that. So Socitm has, historically we have been involved in digital and e-government and shaping of that agenda politically. So certainly with both parties, Conservatives and Labour. More recently with the launch of the Labour review of digital, so I was present at that review. Martin and myself have been in discussion with Peter Wells, who Mark talked about. So I think it's absolutely accept your view that it's important that we step up to that. It's important that we engage with that. We need to not be taking party political positions within that, and I think that's kind of where you're going to, Mark, in that to say you need to understand those things, but not necessarily in a party way. But I believe that absolute digital is political because everything's political. The fact that we're able to have this conversation is political. What you had for breakfast this morning is political. The supply chain that brought that food to your table is political. Everything's political. So to pretend that it's not kind of misses the point of it. So digital is in that space. We are in public service. That is political. We are in a democracy. That is political. So that's inescapable. So I think as an organisation we absolutely need to step up to that, and we need to do it just as Mark described, quite carefully, because there are some political places where you might want to end up. So that's kind of where we're going as an organisation. Nick might want to add a little more to that, unless no, good with that.
As long as you've carried it,
I'll be, you do the stuff. I'll get the blame. Question at the there's a question at the back there, Jeff.
Hi Mark, the Hounslow approach that we had launched.
Remind us who you are, Jeff.
Yeah, sure. Jeff Connell, Newham Havering.
I know who you are, Jeff.
New Vice President.
And one source shared service, but we'll talk about that later. The Hounslow approach is really interesting. We had the launch of that a while ago, and I think we're all quite excited to see where that might lead. It is kind of risky, and we can't all take the risk, but we should all learn from that approach. So can you give us any updates of what's been happening there?
I think one of the most challenging things about it. So it's going well. They're starting to build kind of line of business apps. The platform's in. Document sharing is going well. It's all the big picture is good. I think one of the, as you say, it's risky, and I think it's already got them onto. So they're kind of. They're embracing a digital business model as opposed to sort of other just pure architectural components, and they're already starting to see the benefits of that. Of course, with all platform-based models, you start to get the real benefits when other people join in. And I think the point about, as I mentioned, the kind of Salesforce approach it's a private technology, but the APIs are open. It's been architected openly. It's got a very public commitment to public cloud, and it's been done in such a way that it enables them to. So if it comes from Cloud Foundry or some other kind of open stack in the future, I think it's leaving the door very much more easily open to migrate onto that. And of course, there's also the notion that as part of going through this, they've had to get a grip. They've had to get a grip on their own architecture in a sense maybe that they didn't have before. I think one of the most challenging things we're finding at the moment, and again it's back to the skills issue, is it's just getting enough people with enough skills to kind of embed those in Hounslow and you know there's a lot more interest in this platform coming up, but at the moment that's one of the challenges that we're having. Sort of a
Got time for one last question before our closing address from our incoming president. And Andy, you have the microphone.
Is this on? Yeah. Andy Hopkirk, Socitm. Just picking up the point about neutrality and the position that we can take in this. It's easier to remain neutral if we talk to both sides. Now, obviously, Labour have come up with this idea of having a review, which might lead to a Labour technology manifesto. Who knows? Do you know anything about any plans on the Conservative side to repeat the process they did before the last election of having a Conservative technology manifesto and a review to feed into that?
The simple answer is no. So I mentioned at the beginning when I stuck up my picture of Francis Morden on the right. So I went to their sat on the digital panel in the party conference. There were some intentions, and there were the sort of intentions probably that we've heard before. But it's not to say for a second it's not going on. It's just that they haven't invited me. so I don't know that. I would imagine that they're kind of having a bit of a think. But I don't know at the moment. But certainly, I think what is safe to say is that it doesn't have a very public profile. Whatever is happening, there's no public call, as far as I'm aware, for engagement yet. I'm sure there will, but not yet.
Okay. Excuse me. Thanks for those questions. We better do a round of applause because I just can't speak at the moment.